Tonight, as you settle into the soft embrace of evening, we're going to take a journey together into the mysterious realm of presence, that invisible but powerful force that surrounds each of us like a gentle mist, carrying the essence of who we truly are. You might think that what others sense about you comes only from your words or actions, but there's something far more subtle at work. An ancient language of the soul that speaks without sound, touches without contact, and reveals truths that even we ourselves might not fully understand. If you're enjoying these philosophical journeys into the deeper mysteries of human nature, I'd really appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It helps more than you know, and it tells me that these gentle explorations into the wisdom of great thinkers are finding their way to kindred spirits. I'm always curious where you all are listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. There's something beautiful about knowing our little global community is connecting through these stories, each of us in our own corner of the world, yet traveling together through these timeless insights. Now dim the lights around you, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum that helps the mind settle, or perhaps light a candle if that brings you comfort. Let yourself sink deeper into whatever soft surface holds you tonight. Feel your shoulders release their grip on the day's tensions. Allow your breathing to find its own gentle rhythm. And let's ease into tonight's exploration of something Carl Jung called the psychological aura, that mysterious presence that makes some people unforgettable, even when they've barely spoken a word. Imagine yourself walking along a quiet cobblestone street in Küsnacht, Switzerland, on a misty evening in 1925. The air carries the crisp scent of lake water mixed with wood smoke drifting from stone chimneys, and the soft amber glow of gas lamps creates pools of warmth against the gathering dusk. Your footsteps echo gently off the narrow street walls as you approach a substantial house with ivy climbing its weathered facade. Through one of the tall windows, you can see the flicker of firelight dancing across book-lined walls, and there, seated at a heavy wooden desk, is a man with penetrating eyes and a thoughtful expression, Carl Gustav Jung. As you pause outside, something remarkable happens. Even from this distance, even through glass and stone, you feel something emanating from this figure, not quite warmth, not quite magnetism, but something that makes you want to step closer. It's as if his very presence creates ripples in the air around him, invisible currents that carry a sense of depth, wisdom earned through struggle, and an almost electric authenticity. You realize you're witnessing what Jung himself would come to call a psychological aura, that indefinable quality that makes certain people seem to glow from within, not with light, but with the accumulated force of a soul that has done the hard work of becoming truly itself. Jung knew something that most of us sense but rarely understand, that we are constantly broadcasting signals from the deepest parts of ourselves, sending out invisible messages that others receive on frequencies they don't even know they possess. Like many of us, he had noticed how some people could walk into a room and immediately shift its entire atmosphere, how others seemed to carry a gravitational pull that drew confessions from strangers, and how certain individuals possessed a quiet power that could make others feel simultaneously inspired and unsettled, often without exchanging a single word. What fascinated Jung was not just that these phenomena existed, but why they occurred and what they revealed about the hidden architecture of the human psyche. He began to understand that what we call presence or aura is actually the external reflection of our internal psychological state, the way our conscious mind, our hidden fears, our repressed desires, and our deepest authentic self combine to create an invisible atmosphere that others can sense as clearly as they might feel the approach of a storm. Consider for a moment your own experience with this mysterious force. Perhaps you've encountered someone who made you feel immediately at ease, as if their very being communicated safety and understanding. Or maybe you've met someone whose presence felt so intense, so unfiltered, that being near them was like standing too close to a fire, not necessarily unpleasant, but undeniably powerful. You might have found yourself inexplicably drawn to certain people, or conversely, felt an instinctive urge to maintain distance from others, all without any logical reason you could name. Jung discovered that these reactions aren't random or mystical, but follow predictable patterns rooted in the deepest structures of human psychology. He realized that some people possess what we might call an integrated presence. They have done the difficult inner work of acknowledging and accepting all parts of themselves, both light and shadow, both strength and vulnerability. This integration creates a kind of psychological wholeness that radiates outward, affecting everyone they encounter in profound and often unsettling ways. The truly fascinating part of Jung's insight is this. The very people who possess the most powerful auras are often completely unaware of their effect on others. They're not trying to intimidate or impress. They're simply being authentically themselves, which in a world full of masks and pretense can feel both magnetic and threatening. Their presence acts like a mirror, reflecting back to others the parts of themselves they've hidden away, forgotten, or never dared to acknowledge. As you rest here tonight, feeling the gentle pull of sleep beginning to touch the edges of your consciousness, you might find yourself wondering about your own invisible presence. What signals you're sending, what depth you carry, what authenticity might be waiting to emerge from beneath the comfortable personas you wear through your days. There's something deeply soothing about following these thought paths, allowing Jung's insights to drift through your awareness like clouds across a peaceful sky, neither grasping nor pushing away, simply letting these ideas settle into the quiet spaces of your mind. Perhaps by morning, you'll have discovered something new about the mysterious language your soul speaks to the world. Or maybe you'll simply have rested more deeply, cradled by the understanding that your presence, exactly as you are, carries its own unique form of power and beauty. As we journey deeper tonight into Jung's mapping of the human psyche, you might notice how these concepts begin to illuminate your own experiences, creating gentle, aha moments that feel less like learning and more like remembering something you've always known but never quite put into words. This question of psychological presence opens doors to territories Jung spent his lifetime exploring. The hidden landscapes of the unconscious mind, the archetypal forces that shape our deepest responses to one another, and the profound journey toward becoming fully, authentically yourself. As you drift deeper into relaxation, allow yourself to be curious about these invisible currents that flow between human souls, the way authenticity can be both gift and burden, and how the very qualities that make someone's presence powerful might also make them feel like eternal outsiders in a world that often prefers comfortable superficiality to uncomfortable truth. To truly understand Jung's revolutionary insight about psychological auras, we need to first step back into his world, to feel the intellectual atmosphere of early 20th century Europe, where ancient wisdom was colliding with emerging science, and where one brilliant mind was beginning to chart the vast territories of human consciousness that lay hidden beneath the surface of ordinary awareness. Let's allow ourselves to drift back to those formative years, when Jung first began to notice the patterns that would reshape our understanding of what it means to be authentically, powerfully present in the world. This understanding opens a doorway to those formative years when Jung first began to notice the patterns that would reshape our understanding of human presence, drifting us back to a world where gaslight met emerging electricity, where ancient wisdom collided with revolutionary science, and where one brilliant mind was learning to see the invisible currents that flow between souls. As these thoughts settle like sediment in still water, let yourself be carried back to the Switzerland of Jung's youth, to a time when the mysteries we're exploring tonight were just beginning to stir in the consciousness of a young man who would change how we understand the human psyche forever. Picture yourself stepping into the year 1885, into the quiet village of Keswil, Switzerland, where 10-year-old Carl Gustav Jung walks home from school along dirt paths lined with stone walls covered in moss and ivy. The air carries the crisp scent of alpine meadows mixed with wood smoke from cottage chimneys, and you can hear the distant sound of church bells echoing across the rolling hills, their bronze voices marking the rhythm of a world that still moved at the pace of seasons rather than clocks. As young Carl pushes open the heavy wooden door of his family's parsonage, the hinges creak with the weight of centuries-old craftsmanship, and the smell of beeswax candles and leather-bound books envelops him like a familiar embrace. This was a world suspended between two realities: the ancient spiritual traditions represented by his father's position as a rural pastor, and the exciting new discoveries of science that were beginning to illuminate the hidden workings of the natural world. Jung would later describe feeling caught between these realms from his earliest memories, sensing presences and energies that others couldn't see, experiencing what he would eventually understand as the first stirrings of his lifelong fascination with the invisible dimensions of human experience. Perhaps you felt something similar in your own quieter moments, that sense of being sensitive to currents and atmospheres that others seem to miss, of picking up on things that can't quite be explained but feel undeniably real. As you settle deeper into this historical reverie, imagine the young Jung developing an acute awareness of how differently people affected the spaces around them. In the small, tightly knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business, he began to notice how certain individuals seemed to carry an invisible weight or lightness with them, how the village baker's presence could brighten a room, while the stern schoolmaster's arrival could make conversations falter and children unconsciously step backward. These weren't dramatic gestures or loud proclamations, but something far more subtle, like the way an approaching storm changes the air pressure long before the first clouds appear on the horizon. The Switzerland of Jung's youth was itself a nation caught between worlds, much like the young man who would become one of its most famous sons. This was a time when traditional alpine communities, with their deep roots in folklore and spiritual tradition, were beginning to encounter the rational, scientific worldview emerging from the universities and cities. The tension between these perspectives, between the mystical and the empirical, between ancient wisdom and modern knowledge, would become the very foundation of Jung's later work on the psychological aura and the hidden dimensions of human presence. Walking through Jung's world, you might imagine yourself in the parlor of the family home on a winter evening in 1890, where 15-year-old Carl sits by the fire reading voraciously while his mother, Emily, works quietly at her needlework nearby. The room is lit by the warm, flickering glow of oil lamps that cast dancing shadows across walls lined with theological texts and medical journals, his father's spiritual library mingling with his grandfather's scientific interests. The air smells of pine logs burning in the stone fireplace, and the faint scent of lavender sachets tucked between the pages of well-worn books. In this intimate setting, you can almost feel the invisible currents that Jung was beginning to perceive, the way his mother's presence carried an undercurrent of melancholy that seemed to darken the very air around her. How his father's quiet desperation about his failing faith created a tension that even the family dog would sense, slinking away when the pastor's mood grew particularly heavy. Young Carl, with his developing sensitivity to these atmospheric pressures of the human soul, was learning to read the emotional weather of every room he entered, though he wouldn't have words for these perceptions until much later in his life. This extraordinary sensitivity might have remained nothing more than a peculiar personal trait, but Jung was fortunate to live in an era when the scientific study of the mind was just beginning to emerge. As he grew older and began his medical studies at the University of Basel, he encountered the revolutionary work of psychologists who were starting to map the territories of human consciousness with the same methodical approach that geographers were using to chart unexplored continents. The scratch of his pen on paper during late-night study sessions, the musty smell of library books filled with the latest theories about hysteria and the unconscious mind, the excitement of participating in early experiments with word association tests. All of these experiences were preparing him to become the explorer of inner space, who would eventually give us our understanding of psychological presence. You might imagine Jung in his early 20s, newly graduated and working as a young psychiatrist at the Burgersley Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich, walking the long corridors filled with the soft sounds of patients' whispered conversations and the gentle footsteps of nurses making their rounds. The hospital smelled of carbolic acid and starched linens, but underneath these clinical scents, Jung was beginning to detect something else: the distinctive atmospheres that different patients carried with them. The way some individuals seemed to fill their rooms with an almost palpable sense of chaos, while others radiated a strange calm even in the midst of their psychological storms. It was here, in these institutional hallways where human suffering was laid bare, that Jung first began to systematically observe what he would later call the psychological aura. He noticed how certain patients could affect the entire ward's emotional climate, how others seemed to attract confessions and confidences from both fellow patients and staff members, and how some individuals possessed a presence so intense that it could be felt even when they were silent and motionless. These weren't supernatural phenomena, Jung realized, but natural expressions of the human psyche's hidden depths and complexities. As you drift deeper into this historical landscape, perhaps you can sense the intellectual excitement of those early years when Jung was discovering that the mysterious presences he had noticed since childhood could actually be studied, understood, and explained through careful observation and scientific method. The European intellectual climate of the early 1900s was electric with possibility. Freud was mapping the unconscious. Einstein was revolutionizing physics, and artists like Picasso were breaking apart traditional forms to reveal hidden truths about perception and reality. In this atmosphere of discovery and innovation, Jung began to develop his revolutionary insight that human beings are constantly broadcasting signals from the deepest parts of themselves, creating invisible fields of influence that others can sense and respond to on levels far beneath conscious awareness. The gaslight in his study burned late into many nights as he filled journal after journal with observations about these phenomena, noting patterns and connections that would eventually crystallize into his groundbreaking theories about the structure of the psyche and the nature of authentic presence. What makes Jung's historical moment so fascinating is how personal struggle and intellectual curiosity combined to create the perfect conditions for understanding psychological auras. This was a man who had experienced firsthand the power of invisible human forces, who had grown up sensitive to the emotional climates that people create around themselves, and who was now equipped with the scientific tools to investigate these mysteries systematically. As these thoughts dissolve and reform in your relaxing awareness, you might notice how naturally this historical foundation prepares us to understand Jung's most fundamental insight, that beneath our everyday consciousness lies a vast and mysterious landscape that shapes everything about how we appear to others, and how this hidden realm holds the key to understanding why some people possess such powerful and unsettling presence. Following this thread deeper into the territory Jung was mapping, we find ourselves approaching what he would come to call the totality of the psyche, a concept so revolutionary that it would transform not only psychology, but our entire understanding of what it means to be human in the presence of others. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a moonlit lake on a perfectly still night, where the surface reflects the stars so clearly that you can barely tell where the water ends and the sky begins. What if I told you that this moment of confusion between reflection and reality captures something essential about how Jung came to understand the human mind? Most of us, when we think about consciousness or awareness, imagine something like the tip of an iceberg, the small portion visible above water representing what we can see and know about ourselves, while assuming that what lies beneath is simply more of the same, just hidden from view. But Jung discovered something far more extraordinary and mysterious. Imagine yourself in Jung's study sometime around 1912, the room lit by the warm glow of electric lamps that have recently replaced the gaslight, the air carrying the scent of leather book bindings, and the faint aroma of pipe tobacco that lingers in the heavy curtains. Jung sits at his desk, surrounded by pages covered with notes from his sessions with patients, and you can almost see the moment when a revolutionary understanding begins to dawn in his eyes. The scratch of his pen on paper slows, then stops entirely, as he realizes that what he's been observing in his clinical work points to something that challenges everything psychology has assumed about the nature of mind itself. What Jung discovered was that the psyche, this word he preferred over the more limiting term, mind, encompasses something infinitely more complex and mysterious than the conscious thoughts and feelings we typically associate with our inner lives. The psyche, as Jung began to understand it, includes not only everything we're currently aware of, but also everything we've forgotten, everything we've never quite noticed, everything we've pushed away because it was too uncomfortable or confusing, and perhaps most remarkably, something that seems to exist entirely outside our personal experience, yet somehow belongs to us nonetheless. You might recognize this feeling from those moments when you meet someone for the first time and find yourself inexplicably drawn to them, or conversely, when you feel an immediate and seemingly irrational aversion to another person. Perhaps you've experienced that strange sensation of walking into a room and instantly sensing that something significant has just happened there, even though nothing visible has changed and no one has said a word. These experiences, Jung realized, point to the fact that we're constantly receiving and transmitting information on levels far deeper than our conscious awareness can access or understand. As you settle deeper into this understanding, imagine the psyche not as a static container but as a dynamic living system, something like a vast underground river that flows beneath the landscape of ordinary consciousness, sometimes surfacing in unexpected places, sometimes disappearing entirely from view, but always present, always moving, always influencing the terrain above. This underground river carries with it not only the sediment of our personal history, our memories, our traumas, our forgotten dreams and abandoned hopes, but also something far more ancient and universal, like mineral deposits laid down over geological ages of human experience. Jung began to see that what we call personality or presence is actually the visible expression of this entire underground system, not just the conscious choices and intentions that we imagine define us. When someone walks into a room and immediately changes its atmosphere, when a person's very presence seems to invite either trust or wariness, when certain individuals appear to carry an invisible gravitational field that draws others toward them or pushes them away. These phenomena arise from the deep currents of the psyche expressing themselves through countless subtle channels that operate far below the threshold of conscious awareness. This insight leads us to one of Jung's most profound realizations. That authenticity, that quality which makes some people's presence so powerful and unsettling, isn't about perfecting or controlling our conscious personality, but rather about establishing a healthy relationship between our surface awareness and these deeper currents. Think of it like learning to sail. The skill lies not in controlling the wind, which is impossible, but in understanding how to work with forces much larger than ourselves, how to harness energies that exist independently of our will or wishes. Perhaps you've noticed in your own life how certain experiences seem to arise from depths you didn't know you possessed. Maybe you've surprised yourself by the intensity of your reaction to a piece of music, or found words coming out of your mouth that felt both completely true and completely unexpected, as if they were emerging from some wise part of yourself that you'd never met before. These moments offer glimpses into what Jung understood as the self-regulating nature of the psyche, its tendency to seek balance and wholeness even when our conscious mind is pulling in the opposite direction. Curiously, Jung discovered that the psyche operates according to what he called a compensatory principle, meaning that it automatically works to balance whatever one-sided attitudes or behaviors we've developed consciously. If we've spent years cultivating a cheerful, optimistic persona, the unconscious depths of the psyche will accumulate all the sadness, anger, and disappointment we've avoided acknowledging. If we've prided ourselves on being rational and logical, the psyche will gather and preserve all the irrational, emotional, intuitive aspects of our experience that we've dismissed or ignored. This compensatory function explains why people with the most powerful psychological auras often seem to contain contradictions that somehow make them more, not less, compelling. They radiate a sense of wholeness that includes rather than excludes their shadows and difficulties, creating a presence that feels both deeply human and mysteriously complete. You might think of them as people who have learned to speak the full range of their psyche's language, not just the socially acceptable words their conscious mind prefers to use. As you drift through these ideas, letting them settle into the quieter spaces of your awareness, you might begin to sense how this understanding illuminates something you've perhaps always known, but never quite articulated. The people who affect us most profoundly are rarely those who present themselves as having everything figured out, but rather those who somehow manage to be authentically themselves, complex, contradictory, beautifully and mysteriously human in ways that give others permission to be equally complex and real. This brings us to a beautiful paradox that lies at the heart of Jung's vision, that to develop genuine presence, to cultivate an authentic aura that serves both ourselves and others, we must become comfortable with not knowing everything about ourselves, with allowing space for mystery and surprise, with trusting that the psyche contains wisdom far greater than our conscious understanding can grasp. It's like tending a garden where much of the most important growth happens underground, in darkness, following rhythms and patterns that can only be appreciated over time. The psychological aura, then, emerges not from perfecting our surface personality, but from developing what Jung called a conscious relationship with the unconscious, learning to listen to the deeper currents of the psyche without being overwhelmed by them, finding ways to honor both our light and our shadow, our strength and our vulnerability, our certainty and our confusion. This naturally raises the question of how this mysterious unconscious realm actually operates, what forces and patterns shape its depth, and how we might begin to recognize its influence in the subtle atmospheres that surround each of us as we move through the world. Following this thread deeper into Jung's revolutionary understanding, we find ourselves approaching what he called the ego, not the inflated, self-centered ego of popular psychology, but something far more essential and mysterious. The conscious center of our personality, the part of ourselves that experiences "I am" and decides what deserves our attention in each moment. Picture yourself standing on a rocky coastline at dawn, where an ancient lighthouse rises from the mist like a sentinel between two worlds. The beam sweeps steadily across calm waters, its light illuminating patches of the ocean's surface while casting other areas into deeper shadow, and you realize you're witnessing a perfect metaphor for how Jung understood the ego's role in the vast landscape of human consciousness. The lighthouse keeper, moving purposefully through his rounds, represents that part of ourselves that chooses what to notice, what to remember, what to consider important enough to bring into the bright circle of awareness. As you settle deeper into this coastal scene, feeling the salt-tinged air against your skin and hearing the gentle rhythm of waves against stone, you might begin to sense how the lighthouse's beam, for all its power and precision, can only illuminate a small portion of the infinite ocean that stretches beyond its reach. This is the beautiful limitation that Jung discovered at the heart of human consciousness. Our ego, this remarkable organizing force that gives us our sense of personal identity and continuity over time, can only focus on a tiny fraction of the vast information constantly flowing through our psyche. Imagine yourself climbing the spiral staircase inside this lighthouse, your footsteps echoing against worn stone steps, until you reach the lamp room where the keeper tends his beacon. Here, surrounded by the complex machinery of lenses and mirrors that focus and direct the light, you begin to understand what Jung meant when he described the ego as consciousness organized around a central point of reference. The feeling of I that experiences, decides, remembers, and acts in the world. The ego serves as what Jung called the command headquarters of our conscious personality, sorting through the endless stream of sensations, memories, thoughts, and impulses that arise each moment, selecting what seems most relevant and important while allowing everything else to fade into the background of our awareness. You might recognize this process from your own experience, the way your attention shifts from the feeling of your breath to the sound of distant traffic to a memory that suddenly surfaces, all while countless other potential experiences remain unnoticed, like ships passing beyond the lighthouse's beam. But here's where Jung's insight becomes particularly fascinating for understanding psychological presence. The ego's choices about what to illuminate and what to leave in shadow create a distinctive pattern, a kind of signature that others can sense even when we're not consciously trying to communicate anything at all. Think of how different people seem to carry different qualities of attention. Some individuals feel scattered and restless, their psychological lighthouse beam jumping erratically from topic to topic, while others radiate a centered calm, their attention focused yet spacious, like a beacon that sweeps steadily but never rushes. Perhaps you've encountered someone whose very presence made you feel more focused and peaceful, as if their well-organized inner lighthouse was somehow helping to stabilize your own scattered attention. Or maybe you've met individuals who felt exhausting to be around, their psychological beam flashing chaotically in all directions, creating a sense of mental static that left you feeling drained and unfocused. These experiences point to something Jung discovered about the ego's profound influence on our psychological aura. The way we organize our consciousness internally is constantly broadcasting itself to others through subtle cues they pick up unconsciously. Curiously, Jung found that the most powerful and authentic presences often belong to people who have learned to use their ego not as a fortress protecting them from the unknown depths of their psyche, but as a skilled lighthouse keeper who maintains respectful communication with the vast ocean of unconscious life that surrounds conscious awareness. These individuals seem to possess what we might call a flexible ego, strong enough to maintain clarity and direction, yet humble enough to acknowledge that consciousness represents only a small island in the infinite sea of psychic life. As you drift deeper into this understanding, letting the rhythm of waves and the sweep of the lighthouse beam create a gentle, hypnotic pattern in your awareness, you might begin to notice how this insight illuminates something you've perhaps always sensed, but never quite articulated. The people who affect us most profoundly are often those who seem completely present and attentive when they're with us, yet somehow carry no sense of strain or effort in their attention, as if their psychological lighthouse operates with a kind of effortless precision that feels both focused and spacious at the same time. This quality emerges, Jung discovered, when the ego develops what he called a conscious relationship with the unconscious, learning to recognize that for every piece of information it brings into the spotlight of awareness, vast amounts of equally valid experience are flowing through the darker waters beyond conscious attention. The lighthouse keeper, in other words, becomes wise enough to know that his beam, however bright and necessary, represents only one small circle of light in an ocean filled with currents, depths, and mysteries that deserve respect even when they can't be seen. You might think of this as the difference between an anxious lighthouse keeper who frantically tries to illuminate everything at once, impossible and ultimately exhausting, and a seasoned keeper who trusts that his steady beam, combined with an awareness of the larger patterns of tide and weather, provides sufficient guidance for safe navigation. The second lighthouse feels completely different to approach. Its light seems both more reliable and more welcoming, less frantic and more deeply grounded in wisdom about the relationship between what can be known and what must remain mysterious. This brings us to one of Jung's most important insights about psychological presence, that the ego's relationship with the unknown depths of the psyche determines not only how we experience ourselves, but how others experience us. An ego that tries to control or deny the unconscious creates a brittle, defensive quality in our presence, like a lighthouse that blazes too brightly and creates harsh shadows. Conversely, an ego that maintains respectful awareness of the unconscious depths radiates a quality of groundedness and authenticity that others find both compelling and mysteriously restful. Perhaps you've experienced this difference in your own life, those moments when you felt most authentically yourself, most present and at ease with others, often correspond to times when you've been comfortable not knowing everything, not having all the answers, allowing space for surprise and spontaneity within the overall structure of your conscious intentions. These are moments when your inner lighthouse keeper has found that perfect balance between focused attention and spacious awareness, between conscious direction and unconscious flow. Interestingly, Jung noticed that people with this kind of balanced ego often develop what seems like an almost magnetic quality of presence. Others are drawn to them not because they're perfect or have everything figured out, but because their psychological atmosphere communicates safety. A sense that here is someone who can hold both certainty and uncertainty, both clarity and mystery, without becoming anxious or defensive about the limitations of conscious knowledge. As these ideas settle into the quieter regions of your awareness, like sediment finding its natural resting place at the bottom of a clear pool, you might find yourself curious about what lies in those shadowy waters beyond the ego's beam. What Jung discovered dwelling in the personal unconscious, that vast repository of forgotten memories, repressed feelings, and neglected aspects of personality that continue to influence our presence in ways we rarely recognize. Drifting further along this philosophical path, we descend gently beneath the surface of ordinary consciousness, like a peaceful underwater explorer discovering the hidden landscapes that lie just below the familiar world of everyday awareness. Imagine yourself slipping beneath the moonlit surface of a warm, clear lake, where the water embraces your skin with the perfect temperature of a summer evening, and the gentle pressure of depth creates a cathedral-like hush that makes every sensation feel amplified and sacred. As you drift deeper into this aquatic realm, breathing easily as if the water itself were providing oxygen, you begin to notice fragments of memory floating like luminescent jellyfish through the liquid twilight, images from childhood summers, conversations you thought you'd forgotten, dreams that dissolved upon waking yet somehow remain to influence your moods and reactions in ways you never quite understood. This underwater cavern of consciousness is what Jung called the personal unconscious. And unlike the ego's bright lighthouse beam that operates at the surface, this deeper realm contains everything that was once conscious but has since been forgotten, everything that was perceived but never quite noticed, and perhaps most significantly, everything that was felt but never acknowledged or accepted by the watchful guardian of our surface awareness. The water around you seems to shimmer with these countless memory fragments, each one carrying its own emotional charge, its own significance in the ongoing story of who you are beneath the roles and personas you present to the world. Perhaps you've experienced moments when something unexpected, a scent carried on an evening breeze, a piece of music heard in a crowded store, a particular quality of light falling through windows, suddenly transported you back to a time and place you hadn't thought about in years, bringing with it not just visual memories, but the entire emotional atmosphere of that earlier experience. These moments offer glimpses into the rich, ongoing life of the personal unconscious, where nothing is ever truly lost, where every experience continues to exist in some form, adding its particular coloring to the invisible atmosphere you carry with you through the world. As you float deeper into this inner ocean, you might notice how certain areas seem to pulse with a different kind of energy, like underwater currents that carry more complex cargo than simple memory fragments. Jung discovered that the personal unconscious organizes itself around what he called complexes, emotional clusters that form around significant experiences, particularly those that were too intense, too painful, or too contradictory for the conscious mind to fully process at the time they occurred. Think of these complexes as underwater whirlpools, each one spinning around a central theme, perhaps abandonment, perhaps perfectionism, perhaps the need to be needed, drawing in related memories and feelings until they form their own autonomous psychological weather systems. The fascinating thing about these complexes is how they operate like separate personalities within the larger ecosystem of the psyche, each one carrying its own emotional logic, its own way of interpreting experiences, its own agenda for how life should unfold. You might recognize this phenomenon from those moments when you've surprised yourself by reacting far more intensely to something than the situation seemed to warrant, as if some hidden part of yourself had suddenly seized control and was responding not to what was actually happening, but to some deeper pattern it recognized from the past. Curiously, Jung found that these autonomous complexes within the personal unconscious are one of the primary sources of what others perceive as our psychological aura. When a complex is activated, triggered by some present situation that resonates with its core themes, it begins to influence not only our internal emotional state, but also the subtle signals we send through our posture, our tone of voice, our facial expressions, even the quality of our attention and presence. Others may not understand what they're sensing, but they pick up on the invisible turbulence of an activated complex like animals sensing an approaching storm. Perhaps you've encountered someone who seemed perfectly pleasant on the surface, yet something about their presence made you feel vaguely uncomfortable or on edge, as if there were hidden tensions or unresolved conflicts rippling just beneath their conscious awareness. Or maybe you've met individuals who radiated a particular quality, deep sadness, barely contained anger, or a hungry need for validation, that seemed to fill the space around them even when they were trying to appear cheerful and composed. These experiences point to the way complexes in the personal unconscious continuously influence our psychological atmosphere, creating currents and pressures that others feel even when we ourselves are unaware of their operation. The underwater landscape of the personal unconscious also contains what Jung called the forgotten language of symbolic thinking, the realm where our psyche speaks in images, metaphors, and associations rather than logical propositions. As you drift through these deeper waters, you might notice how memories and feelings don't arrange themselves in the neat chronological order preferred by conscious thinking, but instead cluster around themes and symbols, creating meaningful patterns that bypass rational analysis and speak directly to the intuitive, feeling-based aspects of awareness. This symbolic dimension helps explain why certain people seem to carry an almost archetypal quality in their presence, not because they're trying to be mysterious or profound, but because they've maintained some connection to these deeper currents of symbolic thinking that most of us lose touch with as we adapt to the practical demands of adult life. When someone has preserved or rediscovered this connection, their presence often feels both familiar and otherworldly, as if they're speaking a language that bypasses ordinary social communication and touches something more primal and universal in our response to them. Interestingly, Jung discovered that the personal unconscious is constantly trying to communicate with conscious awareness, sending up dreams, symptoms, slips of the tongue, and sudden emotional reactions like messages in bottles floating to the surface of the psyche's ocean. Most of us, caught up in the busy activities of conscious life, rarely notice these communications, let alone attempt to understand what they might be trying to tell us about the hidden dynamics shaping our inner world, and by extension, our presence in the outer world. Yet those individuals who have learned to pay attention to these messages from the depths, who have developed what Jung called a conscious relationship with the unconscious, often possess a quality of presence that others find both compelling and mysteriously complete. They seem to carry less internal contradiction, fewer hidden tensions, because they've taken the time to acknowledge and integrate at least some of the forgotten or rejected aspects of themselves that continue to live in the shadowy waters beneath conscious awareness. As you consider this idea, drifting peacefully through the luminous depths of your own inner ocean, you might notice how this understanding begins to illuminate the source of authentic presence, not the perfection of surface personality, but the integration of depths, the willingness to acknowledge and work with the full complexity of what lies beneath the ego's organizing beam. Perhaps the most powerful auras belong not to those who have eliminated their unconscious complexes and forgotten memories, but to those who have learned to include them consciously in their understanding of who they are. This brings us to a beautiful paradox that Jung discovered, that the very aspects of ourselves we most want to hide or forget often contain the seeds of our greatest gifts and deepest wisdom. The personal unconscious, for all its shadowy contents and autonomous complexes, also serves as the reservoir from which our most creative insights, our most compassionate responses, and our most authentic expressions of individuality emerge when we learn to approach it with curiosity rather than fear, with inclusion rather than rejection. Yet even as we begin to appreciate the rich, complex landscape of the personal unconscious and its influence on our psychological presence, Jung's investigations led him to discover something even more mysterious and profound, that beneath these personal waters lies an ocean of even greater depth, containing currents and creatures that belong not just to individual experience, but to the shared heritage of human consciousness itself, where the most powerful and universal sources of psychological aura have their ancient origins. Following this thread deeper into territories that stretch beyond the boundaries of individual memory and personal history, we find ourselves approaching what Jung called the collective unconscious, a realm that connects each of us to the accumulated wisdom and experience of countless generations who have faced the eternal questions of human existence. Imagine yourself standing in an ancient temple that has welcomed pilgrims for thousands of years, where the smooth stone floors have been worn into gentle curves by the footsteps of countless seekers, and the air itself seems thick with the accumulated presence of human hopes, fears, and longings that have been whispered within these walls across the centuries. The scent of countless offerings, incense, flowers, oils, has soaked so deeply into the stone that it has become part of the temple's very essence, creating an atmosphere that speaks to something in you that recognizes this place as sacred, without needing any explanation or historical context. As you run your fingers along the carved walls, feeling the texture of symbols and images that were ancient when your grandparents were children, you begin to sense what Jung discovered in his exploration of the human psyche's deepest layers, that there are patterns, images, and ways of understanding that seem to exist independently of personal learning or cultural transmission, arising spontaneously in the dreams, fantasies, and spiritual experiences of people separated by continents and centuries, yet sharing remarkably similar symbolic languages and archetypal themes. This collective unconscious, as Jung came to understand it, functions like a vast underground river system that flows beneath all human consciousness, carrying the accumulated experience of our species in the form of what he called archetypes, not specific ideas or images, but rather universal patterns of human experience that predispose us to respond to fundamental life situations in characteristically human ways. These archetypes are like the deepest currents in the ocean of human consciousness, invisible to the surface observer yet powerful enough to influence the weather patterns of individual personality and presence in ways that often surprise us with their intensity and universality. Perhaps you've experienced moments when you encountered someone who seemed to embody a quality so universal and timeless that they reminded you not of any specific person from your past, but of something much older and more archetypal. The wise grandmother who carries the wisdom of ages, the heroic figure who faces danger with quiet courage, the mysterious stranger whose presence hints at depths of experience and knowledge that extend far beyond ordinary social interaction. These encounters often leave us feeling as though we've brushed against something larger than individual personality, as if we've met someone who carries within their presence the echo of ancient patterns that speak directly to the deepest parts of our own psyche. Curiously, Jung discovered that people who possess the most powerful and compelling psychological auras often seem to have some natural connection to these archetypal energies, not because they're trying to be dramatic or mystical, but because their own psychological development has somehow opened them to serve as channels for these universal patterns. When someone embodies an archetype naturally and authentically, their presence carries a resonance that speaks to something in others that transcends personal preference or individual psychology. It touches the shared human experiences that unite us all beneath our surface differences. You might recognize this phenomenon from your own life in those moments when you felt an instant and inexplicable recognition upon meeting certain people, as if some part of you knew them before you'd ever exchanged names or stories. This isn't the recognition of personal memory, but something deeper, the activation of archetypal patterns that resonate between psyches like tuning forks vibrating in harmony. The person you're meeting may be carrying some universal pattern that awakens the same pattern within your own unconscious depths, creating an immediate sense of connection that bypasses ordinary social interaction entirely. The temple around you seems to pulse gently with these universal rhythms, its ancient stones holding space for the endless variations on eternal themes that have drawn human beings to seek meaning, connection, and transcendence across every culture and historical period. As you settle deeper into this sacred atmosphere, breathing in air that has been breathed by countless others who have faced the same fundamental questions about identity, purpose, love, death, and the mystery of existence, you begin to understand how Jung's discovery explains both the universality of certain human experiences and the particular power that some individuals seem to carry in their very presence. The collective unconscious operates according to what Jung called the archetypal principle, the tendency for certain universal patterns to constellate or activate in response to specific life situations or psychological needs. When someone is facing a major life transition, for example, they may find themselves naturally drawn to people who embody the archetypal energy of the wise guide or mentor. When someone is in need of healing, they often recognize and respond to individuals who carry the presence of the wounded healer, someone whose own experience of pain and recovery has opened them to serve as a vessel for the universal healing energies that flow through the collective unconscious. Perhaps you've noticed how certain people seem to naturally attract others who are in need of exactly what they have to offer, not through any conscious intention or advertising, but simply through the quality of presence they carry. These individuals often report feeling surprised by the number of strangers who approach them with personal problems, confessions, or requests for guidance, as if their psychological aura somehow broadcasts their availability to serve as a conduit for archetypal energies that others desperately need to encounter. This archetypal dimension of psychological presence helps explain why some people's aura feels not just personal, but somehow larger than life, carrying a quality that seems to transcend their individual personality and connect to something universal and timeless. When someone has learned to work consciously with archetypal energies, either through deep personal experience, spiritual practice, or psychological development, their presence often carries what Jung called numinous quality, a sense of encountering something sacred or significant that cannot be reduced to mere personality traits or social skills. Interestingly, Jung found that archetypal energies are most powerfully and authentically expressed through people who have first done the difficult work of confronting their own personal unconscious, integrating their individual complexes and shadow material before becoming clear enough channels for these universal currents. It's as if the collective unconscious requires a certain level of psychological clarity and self-knowledge before it will trust someone to carry its deeper patterns into the world without distorting them through unresolved personal issues. As you consider this idea, feeling the ancient stones of the temple supporting your weight, while the timeless atmosphere wraps around you like a blanket woven from the dreams and aspirations of humanity itself, you might notice how this understanding begins to illuminate the source of the most profound and lasting forms of psychological presence. The people who affect us most deeply are often those who have somehow become transparent to archetypal energies, serving as living bridges between the individual and the universal, the personal and the eternal. This brings us to a beautiful recognition that Jung discovered, that the development of authentic psychological presence is not ultimately about perfecting our individual personality, but about learning to serve something larger than ourselves, becoming clear enough vessels for the universal patterns that want to express themselves through human consciousness and relationship. The most powerful auras often belong to people who have learned to step aside from their ego's need to control and impress, allowing themselves to become instruments through which the deeper wisdom of the collective unconscious can touch and transform others. Yet this very capacity to channel archetypal energies, to carry a presence that speaks to the universal dimensions of human experience, often comes with its own unique challenges and complications, as those who possess such presence frequently find themselves projected upon by others who mistake the archetypal energy for something personal, creating complex dynamics of attraction, idealization, and eventual disappointment that reveal the intricate dance between individual psychology and collective patterns in the mysterious realm of human encounter. This understanding opens a doorway to one of Jung's most profound insights about the nature of psychological presence, that the very qualities which make someone's aura powerful and compelling also tend to make them unknowing screens upon which others project their deepest needs, fears, and unresolved longings. Picture yourself standing on a mountain summit at twilight, where the day's last light creates a vast landscape of rolling hills and valleys stretching endlessly toward the horizon, each ridge and hollow representing different territories of human psychological experience that Jung spent his lifetime mapping with the careful attention of an explorer charting unknown continents. The air at this elevation feels thin and clear, carrying sounds from great distances. The call of a night bird from one valley, the whisper of wind through pine forests in another, and you realize you're witnessing a perfect metaphor for how archetypal presence operates in the world, reaching across vast distances to touch something universal in everyone who encounters it. As the first stars begin to appear in the deepening sky above you, their light traveling across impossible distances to reach your eyes in this moment, You might begin to sense how Jung understood the phenomenon of psychological projection, the way people unconsciously cast their own inner contents onto others, particularly those whose presence seems to carry something they themselves are seeking. Just as these ancient stars appear to be tiny points of light when they are actually massive, burning suns in distant galaxies, the person with a powerful aura often appears to others not as the complex, imperfect human being they actually are, but as a screen upon which observers project their own unlived potential, their hunger for wholeness, their need for guidance or healing. Perhaps you've experienced this mysterious dynamic from one side or the other, either finding yourself inexplicably drawn to someone who seemed to embody qualities you desperately wish to develop in yourself, or discovering that others consistently approached you with expectations and needs that felt both flattering and overwhelming, as if they were seeing in you something that you weren't entirely sure existed. These experiences point to what Jung called the projection mechanism, a fundamental feature of human psychology that occurs when unconscious contents are experienced as existing outside ourselves rather than as potentials within our own psyche. The mountain vista around you seems to pulse gently with the rhythm of this eternal human drama, where individual consciousness meets the vast landscape of collective possibility, and where the very attempt to find wholeness and meaning often leads us to seek in others what we have not yet discovered in ourselves. The shadows in the valleys below grow deeper as night approaches, while the peaks still catch the last rays of sunlight, creating a visual representation of how Jung understood the relationship between conscious and unconscious contents in the dance of human projection. Curiously, Jung discovered that those individuals who possess the most authentic and powerful psychological presence often become unwitting magnets for what he called both positive and negative projections. When someone embodies an archetype naturally, perhaps the wise guide, the creative artist, the spiritual seeker, or the wounded healer, they may find themselves elevated to impossible heights by those who desperately need to encounter that particular energy. The observer, hungry for wisdom or healing or inspiration, unconsciously projects their idealized image of the perfect teacher or healer onto this person, creating an intense but ultimately unstable dynamic of idealization that bears little relationship to the actual individual behind the projection. You might recognize this pattern from your own observations of how certain people seem to attract devoted followers who see them as almost divine, only to eventually become disillusioned when the human being behind the projection inevitably reveals their ordinary struggles, limitations, and imperfections. This cycle of idealization and disappointment reveals one of the hidden costs of carrying a powerful psychological presence, the way it can isolate individuals within a web of others' projections, making genuine human connection paradoxically more difficult despite their apparent magnetic effect on others. As you settle deeper into the mountain's evening embrace, feeling the temperature gradually cool as darkness spreads across the landscape below, you might notice how this understanding illuminates another layer of Jung's insight about psychological auras. The very authenticity that makes someone's presence so compelling also makes them a clear mirror that reflects back to others the contents of their own unconscious, often triggering intense reactions that have nothing to do with the individual themselves and everything to do with what the observer has projected onto them. Interestingly, Jung found that negative projections can be just as powerful and revealing as positive ones. When someone with an integrated, authentic presence encounters individuals who are deeply unconscious of their own shadow material, their repressed anger, envy, or inadequacy. They may find themselves the target of seemingly irrational hostility, criticism, or attempts to diminish their influence. The unconscious observer, uncomfortable with being shown their own potential for growth or healing, may attack the mirror rather than face what it reflects, creating the curious phenomenon where genuinely helpful and harmless people find themselves persistently misunderstood or targeted by those who most need what they have to offer. This dynamic helps explain why Jung observed that individuals on the path of psychological development often experience periods of profound loneliness and social isolation. Their growing authenticity and integration makes them both more attractive and more threatening to others, creating a complex social field where they attract intense interest while simultaneously triggering defensive reactions from those who are not yet ready to face their own unconscious contents. It's as if the very light that makes them visible to those seeking guidance also casts shadows that reveal the hidden fears and resistances of those who approach them. Perhaps you've noticed in your own life how certain relationships seem to operate more through projection than genuine seeing. Those interactions where you sense that the other person is responding not to who you actually are, but to some image or need they've overlaid onto your presence. These encounters can feel both intoxicating and exhausting, offering the temporary satisfaction of being seen as special or important while creating the deeper frustration of not being truly known or appreciated for your actual self, with all its ordinary complexities and contradictions. The landscape below you continues its slow transformation from day to night, and you might find yourself contemplating how Jung's understanding of projection illuminates the broader patterns of human development and consciousness. The journey toward authentic presence, toward developing what Jung called an individuated personality, necessarily involves learning to recognize and withdraw our own projections while simultaneously protecting ourselves from becoming lost in the projections others cast upon us. This process requires developing what Jung described as a kind of psychological discernment, the ability to distinguish between genuine recognition and projection, between authentic connection and the temporary intensity that arises when archetypal energies are activated between people. Those who successfully navigate this terrain often develop a quality of presence that is both accessible and boundaried, open enough to allow authentic connection, while clear enough not to become enmeshed in others' unconscious needs and fantasies. As the night sky deepens around you and the stars become more brilliant against the velvet darkness, you might sense how this understanding points toward the ultimate purpose of developing psychological presence, not to become an object of others' projections, whether positive or negative, but to serve as a clear and stable point of reference that allows others to gradually recognize and reclaim their own projected contents, discovering within themselves the very qualities they initially sought in someone else. This brings us to what Jung considered the most profound and challenging aspect of authentic psychological presence: the recognition that its ultimate purpose is not to gather followers or admirers, but to serve the collective process of human consciousness development, helping others to discover their own capacity for the very qualities that first drew them to seek guidance outside themselves, and learning to hold space for the complex dynamics of projection and recognition that inevitably arise whenever one soul encounters another across the vast landscape of human possibility. As these thoughts settle like sediment in still water, we find ourselves approaching the very heart of Jung's understanding about how authentic presence actually develops, not through perfecting our surface personality or eliminating our difficulties, but through the patient, often difficult work of what he called integration, the conscious process of bringing together all the scattered and sometimes contradictory aspects of ourselves into a more unified and whole expression of human being. Imagine yourself in an artist's studio during the golden hour of late afternoon, where warm sunlight streams through tall windows and illuminates canvases at various stages of completion, some showing bold, confident brushstrokes, while others reveal the artist's struggles with shadow and light, proportion and perspective. The air carries the rich scent of oil paints and turpentine mixed with the fainter aroma of coffee growing cold in a ceramic mug. And everywhere you look you see evidence of the creative process. Brushes standing in glass jars filled with cloudy water, palettes covered with mixtures of colors that reveal the artist's experimentation with different hues and tones. Works that have been painted over multiple times as the artist searched for the perfect expression of their vision. As you move closer to examine the paintings, you notice how the most compelling works are not those that present only beautiful or harmonious images, but rather those that somehow manage to include both light and shadow, beauty and difficulty, clarity and mystery, creating compositions that feel both resolved and alive, finished yet somehow still breathing with the energy of ongoing discovery. This artistic studio serves as a perfect metaphor for what Jung understood about the development of authentic psychological presence. It emerges not from eliminating the darker or more challenging aspects of our personality, but from learning to consciously work with all the colors on our psychological palette, including those shades we might initially prefer to avoid. Perhaps you've noticed in your own life how the people who affect you most deeply are rarely those who present themselves as having achieved some kind of perfection, but rather those who somehow manage to be completely themselves, complex, contradictory, beautifully and recognizably human in ways that make you feel both inspired and relieved. As if their willingness to be authentically imperfect gives you permission to acknowledge your own full humanity, rather than hiding behind a carefully constructed social persona. Jung discovered that this quality of authentic presence emerges through a specific psychological process he called integration, which involves gradually bringing into conscious awareness and accepting responsibility for all the aspects of ourselves that we've previously rejected, denied, or simply never noticed. Think of integration like the artist's process of learning to work with the full spectrum of colors, rather than limiting themselves to only the bright, cheerful hues that are easy on the eye. It requires developing the skill and courage to include darker tones and more complex mixtures that might feel uncomfortable at first, but ultimately create richer, more truthful, and more compelling works of art. The afternoon light in the studio seems to pulse gently as it moves across the various canvases, and you begin to see how this artistic metaphor illuminates Jung's most important insight about what he called shadow work, the process of acknowledging and integrating the parts of ourselves that we've learned to hide or disown. The shadow, in Jung's understanding, contains not only our obviously negative qualities like anger, jealousy, or selfishness, but also our undeveloped potentials, our creative impulses that seemed too risky to express, our capacity for joy that felt too vulnerable to show, all the aspects of our personality that got pushed into the unconscious because they didn't fit with our family's expectations or society's approval. Curiously, Jung found that people who do this shadow work, who take the time and courage to acknowledge and integrate their disowned aspects, often develop a presence that others find mysteriously compelling, even when they can't quite articulate why. It's as if the integration of shadow material creates a kind of psychological wholeness, that others can sense unconsciously. The way you might be drawn to a piece of music that includes both major and minor keys, creating emotional depth and resonance that purely cheerful melodies cannot achieve. You might recognize this phenomenon from your own experience of meeting someone who immediately felt trustworthy and real, not because they were perfect or always positive, but because they seemed comfortable with their own complexity, able to acknowledge their mistakes and limitations without being overwhelmed by shame, capable of feeling and expressing the full range of human emotions without being controlled by any single feeling or mood. As you continue to explore the artist's studio, running your fingers along the smooth wooden surfaces of easels and feeling the slight stickiness of paint that has dried in layers over many months of creative work, you begin to understand how Jung saw the relationship between shadow integration and authentic presence. When we reject or deny aspects of ourselves, we create what he called a psychological split. Part of our energy goes toward maintaining our preferred self-image, while another part goes toward keeping the rejected material hidden from consciousness. This internal division creates a kind of tension or contradiction that others can sense, even when they can't consciously identify what feels off about our presence. Interestingly, Jung discovered that the process of integration doesn't involve becoming a different person, so much as becoming more fully the person we already are beneath our social conditioning and psychological defenses. It's like the difference between a painting that has been carefully constructed to present only socially acceptable imagery, and one that emerges from the artist's authentic engagement with their subject matter, including all the unexpected colors and surprising details that arise when someone is willing to see and express truth rather than just beauty. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this integration process is how it affects not only our relationship with ourselves, but also our capacity to be present with others in their full complexity and humanity. When we've done the work of accepting our own shadow material, we naturally become less reactive to the shadow aspects that others inevitably carry and occasionally express. We develop what Jung called psychological spaciousness, the ability to hold space for contradiction, difficulty, and imperfection without immediately trying to fix, change, or escape from what we're encountering. The golden light in the studio continues to shift and deepen as the afternoon progresses, casting longer shadows that somehow make the colors appear even more vibrant and alive. And you might notice how this natural interplay between light and shadow creates a beauty that neither could achieve alone. This visual harmony reflects what Jung understood about the psychological harmony that emerges when someone has successfully integrated their shadow material. They develop a presence that includes rather than excludes, that embraces rather than defends, that invites rather than intimidates. As you settle deeper into the contemplative atmosphere of the artist's studio, breathing in the rich mixture of creative sense, and feeling the texture of wooden floors worn smooth by years of artistic labor, you might find yourself wondering about your own integration process, the aspects of yourself that you've perhaps been reluctant to acknowledge or include in your conscious self-image. Jung believed that this wondering itself, this gentle curiosity about our own hidden depths, represents the beginning of the integration process that leads to authentic presence. The most beautiful paradox Jung discovered is that as we become more willing to acknowledge and include our shadow material, we simultaneously become more genuinely compassionate and less judgmental toward others, not because we're trying to be good people, but because we've developed a natural understanding of human complexity that makes harsh judgment feel both unnecessary and inaccurate. we begin to recognize that everyone carries both light and shadow, that psychological wholeness includes rather than transcends our human limitations, and that authentic presence emerges not from perfection but from the courage to be genuinely, completely, and consciously human. This understanding naturally leads us toward what Jung considered the ultimate fruit of psychological development, not the elimination of our problems or the achievement of some final state of enlightenment, but the gradual emergence of what he called the self, that deeper organizing principle within the psyche that is larger than our personal ego, yet expresses itself through our individual personality, creating a presence that serves something greater than personal ambition, while remaining uniquely and recognizably our own authentic expression in the world. As this idea settles, another aspect emerges. The way Jung's insights about psychological aura continue to illuminate the mysterious dynamics of human presence that we encounter in our contemporary lives, helping us understand why certain people in our modern world still carry that unmistakable quality of authenticity that seems to transcend the usual social games and performance anxiety that characterize so much of current human interaction. Picture yourself walking into a quiet coffee shop on a peaceful afternoon, where the soft murmur of conversations mingles with the gentle hiss of the espresso machine and the rustle of newspaper pages, and the air carries the rich aroma of freshly ground beans mixed with the subtle scent of pastries warming in a glass display case. Most of the patrons are absorbed in their laptops or phones, creating their own private bubbles of activity within the shared space. But as you scan the room, your attention is drawn to a person sitting alone at a corner table, reading a worn paperback book with the kind of focused yet relaxed attention that seems increasingly rare in our hyper-connected age. Something about this person's presence stands out, though you can't immediately identify what makes them different from everyone else in the cafe. They're not dramatically attractive or unusually dressed, not doing anything that would typically draw attention. Yet there's a quality to their stillness, a sense of being completely present within themselves that creates a subtle but noticeable shift in the energy around their table. As you observe them more closely, you begin to recognize what Jung would have identified as the signs of someone who has developed a conscious relationship with their own depths, creating that mysterious presence that others can sense even across a crowded room. Perhaps you've encountered similar individuals in your own life, people who somehow manage to remain centered and authentic even in our current culture of constant performance and comparison, who seem to carry a quiet authority that has nothing to do with their job title or social status, and everything to do with some inner integration that allows them to be genuinely themselves regardless of their surroundings. These contemporary examples of what Jung called psychological aura demonstrate that his insights remain remarkably relevant, even as the external conditions of human life have changed dramatically since his time. In your own daily experience, you might notice how certain people seem to possess an almost magnetic quality that draws others toward them, not because they're trying to be charismatic or influential, but because their presence communicates something that feels increasingly precious in our modern world: the sense of encountering someone who is actually there, fully present and genuinely available for authentic human connection, rather than merely going through the motions of social interaction while mentally elsewhere. The person in the coffee shop turns a page of their book with the unhurried deliberation of someone who has learned to savor experience rather than rushing toward the next stimulation. And you can almost feel the way their presence creates a small island of calm within the generally anxious energy that characterizes so much of contemporary public life. This quality of presence, what Jung might have called the manifestation of an integrated personality, stands out precisely because it contrasts so sharply with the fragmented, distracted state that has become normal for many people in our current era of information overload and constant connectivity. Curiously, Jung's understanding of psychological aura helps explain why we often feel simultaneously drawn to and slightly uncomfortable around people who embody this kind of authentic presence. Their groundedness and inner coherence acts as an unconscious mirror, reflecting back to us our own potential for integration, while also highlighting the ways we may have become disconnected from our own deeper sources of stability and meaning. The unease we sometimes feel in the presence of genuinely centered people is often the ego's recognition that maintaining our familiar patterns of distraction and performance requires more effort when we're around someone who embodies a different way of being. As you settle into your own chair in the coffee shop, feeling the smooth wooden surface beneath your hands and breathing in the complex mixture of aromas that creates the atmosphere of this shared space, you might notice how Jung's insights illuminate the particular challenges of developing authentic presence in our contemporary context. While the fundamental patterns of human psychology remain constant across cultures and centuries, the specific obstacles to psychological integration have evolved, requiring new applications of Jung's timeless wisdom about the relationship between consciousness and the unconscious depths. Perhaps the most significant difference between Jung's era and our own is the way modern technology and social media have amplified the tendency toward what he called persona identification, the confusion between our authentic self and the image we present to the world. In Jung's time, people might have worn different social masks in different contexts, but they typically had regular periods of solitude and reflection that allowed for connection with their deeper psychological currents. Our current culture of constant documentation and performance can make it increasingly difficult to distinguish between genuine self-expression and the unconscious crafting of an image designed to generate external validation. Yet Jung's framework suggests that this very challenge creates opportunities for deeper self-awareness and integration. When we become conscious of how social media and digital connectivity affect our relationship with ourselves, we can use this awareness as a gateway to the kind of shadow work and psychological integration that Jung saw as essential for developing authentic presence. The person reading peacefully in the corner of the coffee shop may represent someone who has learned to navigate these contemporary challenges while maintaining connection to their own psychological depths. Interestingly, Jung's insights about the magnetic quality of integrated individuals help explain why certain people seem to attract unusually intense responses in our current cultural climate. Someone who has done the work of psychological integration and developed authentic presence may find themselves becoming inadvertent focal points for others' projections of their own hunger for authenticity, genuine connection, and psychological stability. In a world that often feels fragmented and superficial, encountering someone who embodies wholeness and depth can trigger powerful reactions that range from idealization to hostility, depending on the observer's own relationship with their unconscious material. The afternoon light in the coffee shop shifts subtly as clouds move across the sun, creating gentle changes in the quality of illumination that make the ordinary scene feel somehow more alive and present. And you might notice how this natural rhythm contrasts with the artificial urgency that characterizes so much of modern life. This observation points to another way Jung's understanding of psychological aura remains relevant. His recognition that authentic presence emerges from aligning ourselves with natural rhythms and psychological truths, rather than forcing ourselves to conform to external expectations or artificially accelerated timelines. Perhaps you've experienced moments in your own life when you felt most authentically yourself, times when you've been able to speak truthfully, act according to your genuine values, and respond to situations from a place of inner-centeredness rather than reactive anxiety or people-pleasing. These experiences offer glimpses of what Jung called the self in action, that deeper organizing principle that creates coherent, authentic presence when we learn to align our conscious choices with our unconscious wisdom. As you consider this idea, watching the peaceful reader in the corner and feeling the complex social energy of the coffee shop flowing around you like invisible currents, you might begin to sense how Jung's vision of psychological development offers a path toward the kind of presence that serves both individual fulfillment and collective healing. In a culture that often promotes either narcissistic self-focus or self-sacrificing conformity, Jung's concept of individuation points toward a third option, becoming authentically ourselves in service of something larger than our personal ego, developing the kind of presence that naturally contributes to the psychological and spiritual evolution of our communities and relationships. The gentle sounds of the coffee shop continue to weave together into a peaceful symphony of human activity, and you might find yourself wondering how these insights about authentic presence and psychological integration might apply to your own journey of becoming more fully yourself. Recognizing that this development is not a destination to reach, but an ongoing process of conscious relationship with the mysterious depths from which all genuine presence emerges, leading us naturally toward the question of how this understanding invites us to consider our own unique contribution to the vast web of human consciousness that connects us all. As these thoughts dissolve and reform in your relaxing awareness, we find ourselves approaching the gentle completion of our philosophical journey together, not with conclusions or final answers, but with an invitation to rest in the profound understanding that your presence, exactly as you are in this moment, carries its own unique form of wisdom and beauty that the world needs, regardless of whether you can fully see or understand it yourself. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a still lake at dawn, where the morning mist creates a soft boundary between water and sky that seems to shift and breathe with each gentle movement of the air, and the first light of sunrise creates a pearl-like luminescence that makes it impossible to tell where the lake ends and the heavens begin. The silence here feels complete yet alive, filled with the subtle sounds of water lapping against smooth stones, and the distant call of a loon whose voice carries across the water like a thread connecting earth and sky, solitude and communion, the deeply personal and the mysteriously universal. As you breathe in the cool, mist-laden air that carries the fresh scent of water and pine needles, you might notice how this natural scene perfectly captures what Jung understood about the ultimate purpose of developing psychological presence. Not to become someone different or special, but to discover the profound truth that you are already connected to something much larger than your individual personality, already part of the vast, interconnected field of human consciousness that expresses itself through countless unique forms while remaining fundamentally one. Perhaps in your own quieter moments, you've touched this sense of connection, those times when the boundaries between self and world, between individual and universal, seem to soften and dissolve, leaving you with a feeling of belonging that requires no explanation or justification. These experiences, Jung suggested, are glimpses of what he called the self in its largest sense, not just the integrated individual personality, but the recognition that our deepest authenticity connects us to the shared source from which all consciousness emerges. The mist over the lake continues its gentle dance, sometimes thickening until the far shore disappears entirely, sometimes thinning to reveal distant mountains that seem to float like islands in a sea of clouds. And you begin to understand how this natural rhythm mirrors the way authentic presence develops in our lives, not through force or constant effort, but through a patient willingness to allow the boundaries between who we think we are and who we actually are to soften and shift, revealing depths and connections we never knew existed. Jung discovered that as individuals progress along the path of psychological integration, they often experience what he called a gradual dissolution of the artificial boundaries that separate them from others and from the natural world. This doesn't mean losing their individual identity, but rather recognizing that their personal authenticity is not separate from the larger patterns of life and consciousness that flow through all existence. Like the lake that reflects both the sky above and the depths below while maintaining its own unique character, an integrated person becomes a clear surface through which universal energies can move and express themselves. You might recognize this quality in people who have touched you most deeply, those individuals whose presence somehow makes you feel more connected not only to them, but to yourself, to the natural world, to the mysterious forces of creativity and meaning that seem to guide human life from behind the scenes. Their effect on you arises not from their personal charisma or achievements, but from their capacity to serve as transparent windows through which you glimpse your own deeper nature and possibilities. As the morning light continues to strengthen, gradually burning away the mist and revealing the lake's surface as a perfect mirror reflecting the growing brightness of the sky, you might find yourself contemplating the beautiful paradox that Jung identified at the heart of psychological development, that the more fully we become ourselves, the more we recognize our fundamental unity with all life, and the more we serve this larger wholeness, the more uniquely and authentically ourselves we become. This understanding transforms the entire question of psychological aura from something we might try to develop or acquire into something we gradually learn to allow and express. Our authentic presence is not something we create through effort or technique, but something we uncover by removing the layers of conditioning, fear, and false identity that obscure the natural radiance of consciousness expressing itself through our particular form and personality. The lake's surface has become so still that it perfectly reflects the sky above, creating a moment of such visual harmony that it becomes difficult to distinguish between the water and its reflection, between the earthly and the celestial, between what is above and what is below. In this natural mirror, you glimpse what Jung meant when he spoke of the individuated person as someone who has learned to serve as a conscious bridge between the personal and the transpersonal, the individual and the collective, the human and the divine. Perhaps you've sensed this potential within yourself, moments when you felt aligned with something larger than your personal concerns, when your actions seem to arise from a wisdom deeper than your ordinary thinking, when your presence naturally brought comfort, inspiration, or clarity to others without any conscious intention on your part. These experiences point to what Jung called the emergence of the self as the true center of personality, not in opposition to the ego, but as the larger context within which the ego finds its proper role and purpose. As you settle even deeper into the peaceful atmosphere of this dawn lake scene, feeling your breathing slow and your awareness expand to include the gentle sounds of water and wind, the subtle sense of morning air, and the soft play of light across the misty surface, you might notice how this understanding invites you to release any anxiety or striving about developing the right kind of presence or aura. The mystery and beauty you seek is already here, already expressing itself through your unique way of being in the world, already contributing to the vast symphony of human consciousness in ways you may never fully comprehend. Jung's great gift was helping us understand that the development of authentic presence is not about becoming something we're not, but about removing the obstacles to expressing what we already are in our deepest essence. Like the lake that doesn't try to reflect the sky, but simply remains clear and still, allowing its natural reflective capacity to reveal the beauty above. We too can learn to trust our inherent capacity to serve as clear channels for the wisdom, love, and creativity that want to express themselves through human form. The morning continues its gentle progression toward full daylight, and the mist over the lake grows ever more translucent, neither completely solid nor entirely vanished, but existing in that liminal space between states that Jung understood as the natural realm of the soul. Always in process, always becoming, always discovering new ways to express the eternal through the temporal, the infinite through the personal, the universal through the wonderfully, mysteriously individual. As our journey together draws toward its natural close, you might find yourself filled not with new information to remember or techniques to practice, but with a gentle recognition of the profound dignity and beauty of your own presence, exactly as it is still becoming. This recognition itself is perhaps the most authentic form of psychological aura, the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you belong here, that your particular way of experiencing and expressing consciousness is needed, that your presence is a gift to the world simply because you are genuinely, courageously, mysteriously yourself. And so Jung's understanding of presence dissolves like morning mist into the vast quiet of your own being, no longer separate thoughts to hold or remember, but part of the gentle current that carries you deeper into rest, where psychological aura becomes simply the soft rhythm of breathing, and authenticity needs no effort, only this letting go into what you've always been beneath all the seeking and wondering. These insights drift now like leaves on still water, settling into depths where conscious understanding transforms into something wordless and whole, where the boundaries between philosopher and dreamer, between ancient wisdom and this moment's peace, grow soft and permeable until there's no difference between Jung's vision of the integrated self and your own quiet dissolution into sleep. Perhaps these ideas will visit you in dreams, or perhaps they'll simply become part of the texture of tomorrow's presence, woven so naturally into your being that you'll never quite remember learning them, only living them. As consciousness itself becomes like water returning to water, individual awareness melting back into the infinite source from which all presence emerges, and to which it returns, carrying you beyond the need for any knowledge except this gentle breathing, this soft descent into the boundless space where all questions rest, and all answers dream themselves into being.